Hello, everyone. This is Jose Palomino with another episode of the Revenue Throughput Podcast. And today's guest is Lacy Boggs of lacyboggs.com. And Lacy's coming to really share with us some sharp insights on content marketing strategies, especially for B2B companies. And she'll even talk about how we should be thinking sideways when we build a plan for actually using content marketing to build an audience, to build a market, to actually get customers. So without further ado, let's welcome Lacy to our show. Well, welcome, Lacy, to the Revenue Throughput Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Lacy, I love the general area that you cover, that we're going to cover in this interview around content strategies, and so on. But for our listeners, just to be more exact, can you tell us a little bit about who you serve and what do you do for them?
Sure. So we tend to serve mid six-figure and up businesses who are looking for help creating the content that happens between launches or promotions. And what I mean by that is a lot of times businesses will spend a lot of time and energy on a promotion or launching a new product. And then in between those big events, the content falls off, right? They don't do any nurturing in between those massive events. So we specialize in helping create that nurturing content. So blog posts, email, newsletters, and things of that nature to keep the audience primed, growing, and ready to say yes when you make your next offer. So that tends to be our sweet spot.
Wow. So it's kind of like keeping an IV drip going, right? For those momentary, like
Right.
there's a trade show event or there's some other event-based thing, which would be to kill the metaphor, the jolt of drugs, right?
Yeah, exactly. And we want to keep everybody at a little more on an even keel instead of throwing all the resources just at that one event once or twice a year. Let's be nurturing that audience all the time so that they're ready to buy.
Okay, well that's great. So for our audience, by and large, you're going to be in B2B for the most part, although we
Right.
have listeners in all kinds of businesses and just professional marketers as well. But this area of content, especially in industrial categories, is
Mm-hmm.
tricky. So when we think of content and people write about it, you generally see the latest, TikTok campaign or something, something that's trendy, that's kind of cool. It's a new
Sure.
shoe or something like that. And then you have people that say, well, wait a second, I sell a machine, and the machine does, it lets powders fill into a bag or at
Uh-huh.
scale. Woo, real exciting stuff. So how do you create like a content strategy that's meaningful in that really kind of rough and tumble B2B context?
Sure. So the first part is understanding who's the target audience for that content. And that sounds really basic, but a lot of times I see this is where companies miss the mark because maybe they've heard maybe write what you know, which is good advice, except that a lot of times when you do that, you're going to be writing to your peers or your competitors rather than to the audience you want to attract, the people who are going to buy from you. So being sure you have a really clear understanding of who it is you're writing to, and also not just like, oh, it's a buyer I'm writing to, it's a customer, but also like which position in the company is actually making that decision and how do you speak to them and their needs. So one thing I often see is like um, it might be somebody a lower level, not the CEO, who's like, hey, we need this thing, but they're not the person with the purchasing power, right? So how can you create content that helps them sell it to their CEO or whomever has the purchasing decision, right? Those kinds of questions can help you direct the content strategy. The next idea that I like to play with, I call thinking sideways. So when you have a product, a machine, something like that, it can be really tempting to just talk about the product all the time, right? I have a widget, it does XYZ. But what we can do is we can think sideways and say to ourselves, okay, what else does the person who needs my widget, what else are they interested in? What else do they need to know? What else is helpful to them? Because a lot of times content that's helpful, even if it's not a direct, like, here's how to buy the machine that puts the powder in the bag, that's going to be the one that remains top of mind for the buyer over the long term, right? So if we can figure out what else do they need to know, what else are they interested in? Is it industry news? Is it environmental concerns? Is it efficiency? Like there's lots of different topics we might consider. But when we can be helpful in that way to the end buyer, especially when there's a long sales cycle, like they may not need that machine right now, but they will eventually. it helps keep you top of mind. And so that's where I would probably start with that kind of a content strategy. And everything can be made interesting at some level, right? Especially when we niche it down to a very specific audience and understand what they are interested in, then we can make it interesting.
Now, I believe that what you just said there a great deal until I remember I had in a group session we were doing training, and there was somebody who actually made cement blocks.
Okay.
So I was like, okay, we're gonna try to find the sexy in cement blocks.
Well, again, that might be, yeah, that's always going to be tricky. But when we start thinking sideways, like I bet if you go on Pinterest right now and look up cement blocks, you're going to find all kinds of interesting content about what to do with them
Okay.
for the end user. Now, that may or may not be appropriate for the manufacturer, but it could be fun, right? It could be an interesting way to differentiate themselves in the market.
Well, I love the sideways thinking, and a lot of what you described, Lacy, is really just. And I'm not minimizing it in any way. I'm just saying it's consistent with good selling. Like
Yeah,
it's
sure.
good selling, good marketing, good strategy. Like who are we trying to reach? And and by the way, those questions, because you're in the space, I'm in the space. They honestly shouldn't be that profound, but yet they are because they challenge people. And the reason is that somebody's in business for 30, 40 years, and they say, "Who's my best customer?" Well, we do this, and then we also serve this industry, and so how do I pick? And so, what do you say to somebody who says, you've actually been successful, you've had a range of successes in different industries. How do you pick who to aim for with that content strategy?
That's a great question. I feel like we'd have to look at it a little bit deeper, but a lot of times you don't necessarily have to pick forever, right? We can create internal sales cycles that maybe, or content cycles, if you want to look at it that way, that maybe address a specific consumer for a little while, and then we switch, and that can be really useful to attract different market segments. And there's a couple of different ways to approach that. You can do it where you have a cycle where, oh, we're just talking to customer A for 6 weeks or something like that. Or you can volley back and forth, right? Okay, this week we're going to target customer A. This week we're going to write something for customer B, and so on. A lot of times the pushback I get on that one is like, oh, but if I write for customer A for 6 weeks, isn't customer B going to get bored and leave? The answer is usually no, because they understand that content is just not for them, and that you'll probably come back to them, right? Occasionally you'll get some unsubscribes, but the other thing to remember is that not every person is opening and reading every email or clicking
Sure.
on and reading every blog post. So they can sort of self-select.
As long as the thrust of what you're doing, it sounds like it's like if you're helpful, if your intent is we're going to publish stuff that's good and helpful and nutritious for whoever reads it, right?
Right.
Then you're going to have an audience for that because it's helpful. So let me ask you this question, because I've had this debate with some folks who come from the SEO, looking
Sure.
at everything's SEO. SEO is everything, right? So that's the world. So they say, well, the algorithm says now we have to have 3,000 word essays, in the post, or else it's not going to rank. And ranking is everything. How do you respond to that when people may actually believe the first part of what you said? Like, let me just put stuff out there that's useful, but it's not always going to be 3,000 word essays. I
Mm-hmm.
don't have 3,000 words to say on the topic.
On cement blocks.
Right.
Yeah, I feel you. So, I mean, our philosophy is always that we write for humans first and Google second. And so SEO can and should be part of a strategy, but it's not necessarily the whole strategy, right? So you and I were talking before you hit record about how sometimes content for content's sake or content for SEO's sake is just so annoying, and it's just out there and somebody who's just stuffing keywords, right? Your clients are pretty savvy, a lot of them, and if you do that, they're going to notice. Like, a lot of them, they're going to notice that this is not good content, and they're going to be like, man, whatever. But when we have a content strategy that's written for humans first, we can find those opportunities to rank for SEO and write something that's helpful. Or we can go back and forth, or we can sprinkle SEO into something we were going to write anyway, right? It may not rank number one for the number one search term, but hey, that long tail keyword is getting you some traffic too, right? There's a lot of different, it's not a zero sum game, in my opinion. I feel like we can show up and be useful and show up in Google search results. And often the two help each other rather than being opposed.
So an owner, and thank you for that, Lacey.
Mhm.
That's very helpful. And I think for somebody listening and saying, well, I want to be useful, I want to get this, but it's starting to sound like there's a lot of, it sounds a little technical. It sounds like there's stuff I got to think about. And, I'm just running my manufacturing company. My industrial service company. I'm a professional service company. I'm, the senior partner of a CPA firm. Uh, how do I get my head wrapped around, like, where do I start? Is it just hire a firm and let them worry about it? And can you do it that way? Can you just say, okay, I hired you, you take care of my content strategy from now on? Is it that simple?
So you can. I prefer more of a collaborative effort because here's the thing. I'm not an expert in cement locks. I'm not a CPA. So therefore, I'm not an expert necessarily in your industry, right? So there could, of course, there's a million copywriters out there. There's a million content strategists. There could be someone who is an expert in your industry.
Mm-hmm.
But generally speaking, I feel like building a strategy with somebody, a collaborative effort, is going to be much more effective than just handing it off. And so what I mean by that is the first thing I want to know when we do a strategy session is what are the company's goals? What are the big goals? And then from that, we say, okay, how can content help serve those goals? And what are the metrics we're going to track to see if we're doing that, right? Because a lot of times what happens is people are like, okay, we just need content. And then they don't really track if it's working, or they're tracking the wrong metrics. They're tracking some vanity metrics that don't really impact the bottom line, and so on. So I always start with those numbers because I want to make sure, is this really what you need to be doing? How do we create a content plan then that's going to support your overall business goals? Because I could write the best blog post in the world, but if it's not aligned with your goals, it's not going to do anything for your business, right? So that's where we always start. And so from there, we want to make it as much as an easy button service for the owner or whomever is in charge as possible. But we're going to have to do some information mining, right? We're going to need to interview you. We're going to need to look at your sales and marketing materials. Maybe we have a contact in the sales and marketing department or whatever that is. Because over time, we can become, I like to call us mini experts in your business. I'm never going to be as expert as you in your business, but we can learn over time and become more and more expert so that the owner, the CEO, spends less and less of their time telling us what to write, giving us the information, and so on and so forth. So that's always the goal with our service.
So there is no free lunch, right? There's, at some point, somebody has to invest some time, whoever they retain, right? They find a firm or they hire some. So when we look at content, right, one of the big areas of content, of course, and I alluded to it before, is like social media, right? So like so you think about blog posts, think about maybe downloadable assets like a white paper or a guide or something. And then social media seems to be like, it has to be much shorter, much pithier, more frequent. And I could just imagine some of the owners I know, if they're listening to this, they're thinking, I can't get my head wrapped around all of that. That's a lot of work. And here's the fundamental question: is the juice worth the squeeze?
Right.
Because it seems like a lot of squeezing. What am I going to get out of that?
So this is again where we need to kind of look at your specific business and who your customer is. Because if you're selling, as you said, machines that put powder in bags, if they're not hanging out on TikTok, let's not be on TikTok. That's a waste of time and energy and resources. If they are, however, maybe hanging out on LinkedIn because that's where they do business, then, maybe it's much more better use of our time to be putting articles and posts and things on LinkedIn where they can find us, where they're hanging out. So that would be the first thing I would say, is we have to do kind of an audit and say, like, are your people actually spending their time on X social media channel? The other thing I always like to say is that we kind of, in my business or in my agency, we like to think of it as kind of a hub and spoke model, right? So the hub of the wheel is the long form content, the blog posts, the downloadable white paper, et cetera. The spokes are whatever distribution channels you choose. So that could be social media, email, if you have a podcast, if you do videos, whatever that is, right? And all roads lead to Rome. They all point back to that hub. So then what that does for us is, if we know that we want all our social media posts, or the majority of them, to be pointing back to that long form content, we can just start taking clips from the content. We can take paragraphs, quotes, the introduction, the conclusion, whatever, and turn it into those pithy, quick, and multiple social media posts that you need to be relevant. on social media, but it's a matter of like repurposing what you've already put your time and energy into in different ways. So there's a lot of different ways that we can slice and dice a nice long juicy blog post or a white paper or whatever it might be, and then use those choppings to send traffic back to that original piece. Because what we really want them to do is come to the website, read that piece, and then take an action, right? Sign up for an email, get a demo, contact the sales team, whatever it is.
And when they're ready, because like you said, some of these things are very long. We're not even budgeting until 2023 for the new cyclotron or whatever. But nonetheless, it's who's going to be top of mind when they are ready. Exactly. And you're managing this at scale, because that's the other thing, is content can reach many, many more people than you could ever be calling, or even in a trade show where you might exchange 20 or 30 cards compared to reaching potentially thousands. Okay. So as you look at this, and I think just asking you, Lacy, to look back at your experience, what would be a good example? You don't have to name names, just like a type of company that you think, started with very little content, and 2 years later, their content strategy has become like a building block of their marketing.
Sure. I think a good example for your audience is probably, we worked with a company called Bluffworks a few years ago. They make travel clothing, so technical travel clothing that doesn't look technical. And when I started with them, they were going through a rebrand. And what had happened was they had gone through a big, like $50,000 rebrand that was all like models and looking very fashion. And it completely tanked because the entire brand was built on the personality of their CEO, Stefan Lobel. So when I came in, they were rewriting everything, doing it again. And we wanted to bring Stefan back into the brand. So we spent 2 or 3 years writing content, doing blog posts and social media from his perspective, right? Because he's a really interesting guy, traveled all over the world, has a lot of interesting stories. What happened was, about 3 years in, they started out on a Kickstarter model, right? So every time he wanted to launch a new pair of pants, he would go on Kickstarter and get people to.
But I just have to ask, Lacy, technical travel clothing. I'm sorry.
Meaning like wrinkle-free, dries fast, that kind of thing. But it looks like if you ever go into I'm trying to think of a good example, but you've probably been on a trip where somebody's wearing ugly khakis and weird shirts. These look like suits, like slacks and blazers and stuff like that. But like you can dive in one of his funniest things was he got in a fountain in New York and got all wet and then got out and he still looked great as soon as it dried, right? So that's the kind of stuff we were doing. Anyway, about 2-3 years in, he decided to move to an angel investing model. And so we wrote a blog post about it, and we wrote an email to his list, which was like 10,000 guys who buy pants, right? This was not an investing list. And saying, this is what we're doing and this is why we're changing. And at the bottom, we put a PS. If you're an accredited investor and you're interested, respond to this and you'll reach Stefan and let us know. Within 24 hours, he had 16 responses.
Oh my goodness.
And that turned into 3 people who invested over $300,000 in his company. So I love to call that my $300,000 email. But as much as I'd like to claim it was all my writing that got him that $300,000, it was actually, I think, the 2 to 3 years we spent building up trust, communicating with people, being useful, being entertaining in his instance, and building that marketing strategy that got him that $300,000 in investing.
Wow. So that's a real, there's dollars and cents behind at the end.
Right. That's a good ROI.
Yeah. And part of it, some would say, well, it was just the message to those people, but you wouldn't have that list had you not been cultivating them with good content all the way along, where they even cared to read it and to open the email in the first place. And
feel like they knew Stefan, they knew the brand, they could trust it, and they were ready to say, yes, here's my money.
Wow. So just very quickly here, Lacy, in the time we have remaining, just interested in terms of like white papers, guides, things that are longer form, right? So one thing is a blog. The other thing is a downloadable PDF. And they're all over the internet. Obviously, everybody's downloaded, probably like today, they probably downloaded two downloadables. Trend-wise, is that still important? Do people actually still read these things? Or is just a lot of effort producing them, people download them and they get forgotten and they're just somewhere sitting on a hard drive?
So I think it's a little bit of both. So we do have statistics that say that long form content, blog posts, articles, and white paper type things in particular are still the most effective form of content marketing, especially for the B2B market. So that's something you can take to the bank. Those are still the most effective and cost effective ways to market. However, I think in practice, I think people a lot of times will do what you're saying. They will download a white paper, it sits on their hard drive. They may or may not ever read it. What it is useful for, though, in your business is if you ask people to opt in to give you an email address in order to deliver it, then you have the opportunity to continue to market to them, right? So whether or not they actually wrote that white paper, you have the opportunity to then continue to send them emails over time. And so especially for those businesses you were talking about that have a very long sales cycle, that can be invaluable, because if you do enough to stay in their inbox, they don't unsubscribe, then you've already like crossed the hurdle, right? Because you are top of mind when they're ready to make the purchase, because you're in their inbox already. So it's a balance between providing that useful service as an email and not being too spammy salesy that's going to get you unsubscribed.
Right. And by the time they contact you for something a year from now, they may forgot how they even got on your
100%.
list.
Exactly.
But they like it and they say it's good. It's good stuff. Wow. Speaking of good stuff, Lacy, this has been really good stuff. So thank you so much for that. And
my pleasure.
for somebody listening, say, well, gee, I want to know more about Lacy, what she does, and so on. Where should they go to find out more about you or contact you?
Sure. You can go to lacyboggs.com. That's where I hang out. And, I put together an editorial calendar template. So if you'd like to start putting together your own sort of content strategy in a basic way, you can see how I put it together and my methodology. You can download that for free. I'll put it at lacyboggs.com/revenue.
Okay.
And that'll be just for your listeners. And we will, you can check that out, download the template, and get started if you're somebody who's interested in trying to put together a content marketing strategy.
Fantastic. Really appreciate that, Lacy. It's very kind of you, and it's been great to have you on the Revenue Throughput podcast today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.